and welcome to another episode of Are You Smarter Than a Libertarian? I'm your host, Jeff Metric, and today we're diving into a topic that's not really covered that much. And it's not just controversial, it's also reshaping the global energy landscape. We're talking about Africa, fossil fuels, and the relentless Western push towards net zero emissions. Sounds complicated. Don't worry, we're going to untangle this knot in the next few minutes, so buckle up. Let's talk about the controversy around net zero. And here's the premise. Western officials keep insisting that African nations must divest from fossil fuels in favor of renewables. The argument: fossil fuels cause climate change and we need a global transition to clean energy to save the planet. But what if that transition comes at the cost of Africa's development? We see a massive double standard. Historically, today's richest nations use fossil fuel to power their industrial revolution. Now, they're telling Africa, nope, you can't do that. Please skip fossil fuels and jump straight to renewables. But is that realistic or even ethical? We'll explore the financial, infrastructural, and ethical hurdles here and ask, is it really fair to enforce this transition on developing countries that are still trying to lift themselves out of abject poverty? All right. The dependability of fossil fuels. First things first, why do fossil fuels matter so much for Africa's growth? The simple answer is reliability. When you're trying to industrialize, building factories, expanding power grids, and fueling transportation, you need a constant, dependable energy source. Right now, fossil fuels provide that steady stream of energy day and night. Renewable energies, particularly solar and wind, just aren't as dependable. Sunlight and wind conditions aren't always consistent, and the technology required to store that energy, like battery storage, is expensive. Many African nations already dealing with strained economies can't afford to pour billions and billions into infrastructure for energy storage and grid updates just to make renewable work around the clock. Now let's get into a study by Caleb P. Garrett and company. But let's put some academic weight behind this so it's not just me saying it. A recent study published by Caleb P. Garrett and her co-workers points to some major obstacles in transitioning to renewables. First one is infrastructure limitations. Even the wealthiest countries can't seem to upgrade their power grids fast enough to accommodate the irregular flow of solar and wind. Grid congestion. When the sun shines brightly or the winds blow hard, you can get massive surges in energy. This can overload grids that aren't designed to handle power spikes and drops. The free market. Resource competition. Building renewables at scale requires minerals, metals, and land. These are resources that might be more urgently needed elsewhere in developing economies. If developed nations with their advanced infrastructure are struggling to meet demand reliability with renewables, imagine the challenges for Africa where electrical grids may already be underfunded and outdated. Now let's get even more into it. The astronomical cost of net zero. Think about this when you hear people say we need to be net zero. Let's talk about money. John M. Deutsch, in his article, Is Net Zero a Possible Solution to the Climate Problem?, lays out the cost. Trillions of dollars every year to meet net zero goals on a global scale. Now, wealthier nations can't even foot the bill. How are developing nations supposed to manage? If an African country is forced to spend billions on renewables, that money isn't going to healthcare, education, or roads, basic essentials for development. It's a classic trade-off. And so far, Western promises of financial support to help developing nations go green haven't materialized. Back in 2009, almost 20 years ago, at the UN Climate Conference, wealthy countries pledged $100 billion a year to support green initiatives in developing nations. Fast forward to today. Not only have these pledges been underlooked, but developing nations claim they're owed over $1 trillion in promised funds. Let's be real. There's very little chance Africa will be compensated for the economic opportunities it must forgo if it abandons fossil fuels. That's the economic side. Now let's get into the ethical questions. There's a lot of ethical questions about this. Moving beyond the money, let's tackle the ethics. V. Ismat Ulgersal, I'm probably butchering that name, in The Ethics of Decarbonization for the poor highlights a critical point. Cheap, reliable energy is key to uplifting communities out of poverty. Look at China as a great historical example of that. When they started burning coal and producing a lot of electricity, they were able to lift people out of poverty. Historically, Western countries use coal, oil, natural gas to power their way to prosperity. Now, these same nations are telling Africa to skip that critical step. Is that not at best hypocritical and at worst outright immoral? Ugersol argues that economic development hinges on increased energy consumption. If we truly believe in poverty alleviation, we have to encourage reliable energy for developing nations. Meanwhile, we see wealthy nations returning to coal when push comes to shove, like Europe pivoted back to coal during the 2022 energy crisis. Yet, they want Africa to keep its fossil fuels in the ground. There's a glaring double standard. The reality of productivity costs. Now let's see what this means for Africa's productivity. A study by Lian Sen and El Hijad Fall about the productivity costs of green energy in Africa reveals that switching to renewables can bring about significant economic loss. Industries dependent on cheap power, manufacturing, mining, and so on could see energy costs soar, making them less competitive globally. Look at Western economies to see the ripple effects of poor energy policy. The UK has embraced net zero policies, and guess what? Its businesses are suffering from skyrocketing energy bills. Meanwhile, the United States leveraged fracking to keep its energy prices relatively low, boosting domestic industry. This is a clear lesson. When you restrict fossil fuel development, you risk higher costs that can slow or even reverse economic growth. ESG goals and their pitfalls. This was a big thing out of Davos last year in Switzerland. And here's another buzzword you've likely heard. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Proponents claim ESG investing leads to long-term profitability and social benefits, but the truth is far more complicated. For many African nations, imposing ESG goals often means adding extra financial burdens. You need compliance measures, audits, and specialized infrastructure. All of these steps can drain resources that would otherwise go directly towards building schools, hospitals, and industries. Countries like Nigeria, for example, risk stifling their fossil fuel sector if they follow strict ESG guidelines, missing out on revenue that could fund essential services. If ESG doesn't tangibly benefit your economy, why prioritize it over immediate needs? Now, let's get to the changing political winds in the West. The political tides of the United States are also shifting. With Donald Trump as president, or even the possibility of his re-election or a similar orientated administration, the era of strict American climate pressure could be coming to an end. Essentially, if the U.S. isn't going to force its own companies and consumers to kneecap fossil fuel production, why should African nations do the same at their own expense? The fact is, Western nations can be fickle. When their own energy security is threatened, they quickly revert to the tried and true fossil fuels. So African leaders should carefully consider whether the next round of Western policies will be consistent or if they'll once again pivot and leave Africa dealing with the consequences of having abandoned its fossil fuel assets. Conclusion: Africa's road to prosperity, and we all want Africa to be a prosperous continent. So, where does this leave us? The net zero agenda looks noble on paper, but implementing it in Africa without the necessary infrastructure, funds, and technology know-how is doomed to fail. Beyond failing, it risks condemning millions to continued poverty. If you can't reliably power factories and keep the lights on in schools and hospitals, you're stuck in a cycle of underdevelopment. Moreover, it is unjust and unethical to demand that Africa pay the price for a global environmental agenda that wealthier nations struggle to finance themselves. It's also hypocritical to ask Africa not to use fossil fuels when Europe and North America still rely on them for a significant chunk of their energy. That's why I believe African countries should ignore the misguided Western push and focus on pragmatic strategies for economic growth. Strategies that include developing their own fossil fuel resources. And if Western leaders are genuinely concerned about climate change, maybe they should start by fully honoring the financial commitments they've made over a decade ago. And that wraps up today's episode of Are You Smarter Than a Libertarian? What do you think? Is the Western push for net zero in Africa truly about saving the planet, or is it more about controlling how other regions develop? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe for more libertarian takes on global issues. Until next time, I'm your host, Jeff Metrick, reminding you new videos drop every day. Until next time, stay free, stay informed, stay accountable. Have a good day.